Okay, there we go. Alright, just going to start off with some basic questions. Well, I guess I'll just start with, we're here at Bob Booth's home at
33 Morrison Avenue.
Morrison Avenue in Plattsburgh. And it's 2 o'clock right now. And I'm Nathan Searing, the interviewer. And let's just start with some simple questions. What is your full name?
Robert T. Booth.
Okay.
B-O-O-T-H.
And when were you born?
July 5, 1923.
And what was your pre-war education?
Well, I got as far, got through high school. I went to Northwood School. I was at Yale University as a freshman for 4 months when Pearl Harbor started. And the story begins there.
All right. And what was your occupation?
Student.
Student. How did you hear about Pearl Harbor, and where were you when you heard about it, and what was your reaction to that?
Well, I was at college. I was wherever I was on the campus.
Mm-hmm.
As I recall, the word came to us late in the day, dinner time perhaps. And of course it was by word of mouth to begin with, because communication was far less active
Mm-hmm.
then than it is now. It swelled up. It became a on-campus, almost a riot. A mob of students gathered together, proclaiming all kinds of things, and then got together and walked about 7 or 8 city blocks across campus to the president's house. To do what? I haven't any idea, except if you've heard of mob psychology, it was a mob going to do something and full of bravery and outrage and determination and all that kind of stuff. So what's the best thing to do? It's march on the president and scare him to death.
Yeah.
So he, that was after dark, and he fortunately was in a 2-story house with a sort of a porch at the 2nd-story level,
Mm-hmm.
and he made some kind of an impromptu speech that told us to go back and get to work, that we would do more good in that than anything else. So it kind of wound down after that, but it was a pretty upsetting day.
Yeah.
And from that point on, of course, we really were no longer in control of our lives.
All right. When did you enter the service?
About February 1943.
And you enlisted yourself, or were you drafted?
Well, it's a long, complicated story, but in college I was in ROTC, which meant that I was receiving classes for credit in military science, part of my regular curriculum. I had gradually increased the amount of investment they put into my military education, so we were held back from the draft. That point ran out, so we were obliged to enlist in what was called the enlisted reserve, which we did. From that point on, we were in college doing the same thing in uniform, like one of many other kinds of programs like that.
Okay.
So that by early spring of 1940, well, before that, in the fall of 1943, I had been to Fort Bragg for basic training, field artillery. We came back to the campus in about October, went into the so-called ASTP program, which was another military-owned program, and stayed there until we received our assignments to go to Officer Candidate School at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. And I came out of that after 4 months with a 2nd lieutenant's bars, and then got shipped to a military organization
Okay.
as a full full-time soldier and officer.
Mm-hmm. And what branch of service did you enter?
Field artillery.
Field artillery?
From start to finish, yes.
Yeah. And where did you receive your basic training, and was there any significant experiences or feelings that you had there?
I was receiving training all along
Yeah.
in the ROTC program. Basic training was a separate 4-month ordinary basic training with draftees and other
Mm-hmm.
college kids like me. That was at Fort Bragg.
Okay. And what were your, it says dates of service, like, I guess what, you said you entered in 40.
Well, I was in the, let's say I was in the service as an enlisted man
Yeah.
through basic training. And then several months of college after that, where I was still in the Army unassigned, if you will,
Okay.
except to that training program. Then I had 4 months in Officers Candidate School. And from that, I was a cadet. I guess that was the rank I had.
Okay.
Then I became an officer on June 3rd, 1944. Then I got assigned to the 87th Infantry Division, which was a real military organization.
Okay.
Which is not to say the others weren't. It just
Yeah.
changed and graduated step by step.
Yeah. Alright, so what was the theater of action and like the battles you were in chronological order, I suppose?
I went
if
to
you
Europe. Various things along the way that were interesting, but in any case, specifically on that point, we entered France in the first days of December 1944. It took a period of time to get the whole organization joined together in one place. They came in different ways at different times, and then had to be moved across France. So we went from the Channel shore, so to speak, and we went inland. First stop we made was at Metz, which is a city on the Belgian border, France and Belgium, northern France. Noted because it was on the crossroads of history. When the invasion occurred, Metz always got it.
Yeah.
Over hundreds of years. It also, in those days before the war started, the French and the Germans had both built defensive lines all across their borders on the north and on the south, north of France. The Maginot Line was the French line. It had 5 massive forts that went 3 stories underground and all interconnected across the countryside at Metz, which in September 1944 had been overrun and bypassed. So these islands of forts in the Maginot Line were just stuck there. They were 40 miles behind the front line.
Wow.
And we, American Army, just sent in units constantly. They were under surveillance, surrounded, and our job was to harass them with artillery fire day and night and so on. They'd been there for at least 6 weeks by the time we arrived, and that was the first thing we did. We set up as artillerymen. Some very few went forward to be forward observers with the infantry. Most stayed with the guns, which I did. I just did whatever you did, firing at something you never saw. And then after a few days of that, they surrendered to our troops. And we moved on in northern France to the province of Alsace, A-L-S-A-C-E, which is in the Saar Valley, which is a noted area historically and otherwise because it It has coal mines, it has iron mines. And, Alsace province is a northern province that projects like a finger into Germany, and the people there are French and German, and some are truly French and truly German and speak the language.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody can do some of it, and they have been owned by Germany or by France 20 times in the last 300 years. They don't know who they are. They have handy the flag of each nation in their attic. Depending on who they belong to, they hang that flag up.
Hmm.
So we were there, and that's where we started first to fight in the middle of December. And that's where I first was engaged and put to work as an artillery forward observer, sitting beside an infantry company commander and firing on the enemy, and they jumped off and they did their first assault. And it went on from there. My job was in and out. I was assigned, I was withdrawn, I went somewhere else and was assigned, and so that continued until we had actually crossed the French border and actually could say we had entered Germany by a mile or two.
Mm-hmm.
When Christmas came, the Christmas period, the Battle of the Bulge, which was a fantastic, massive operation, had started on December 16. So everything that had been done was in a state of changing and being transferred to meet that threat. So we were stopped, and we were in a holding pattern.
Mm-hmm.
We were pulled back on Christmas Eve, put on the road after that, day and a half, 24 hours, no stop, freezing weather, and rushed up to northern France at a city called Rhineland, where we were placed in what was called strategic reserve. They didn't know where they were going to plug us in other words. And then after a couple of days of that, we went forward into Belgium and began to take our part in that, which I was involved in again, similarly. And after we were probably there no more than 10 days. I'd been active a couple of times. Finally, I got into a situation where no matter how active it was, it didn't work out. We got wiped out, and I was captured. And so my story from that point is a different kind of military.
Mm-hmm.
But I became missing in action and marched across the countryside, and that's what this pamphlet here is all about from that point on.
Mm-hmm.
But that was my career. It was really very short. I didn't actually smell any gunpowder for more than a month.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't up front being shot at all that while either.
Yeah, more in the back, just shooting
at the kind of
machines.
I'm either working with the guns or
Yeah.
going up front to be a forward observer, which I did in different places, but
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't a steady job in one location.
Yeah, it just, like, how did you feel about combat? Was there any sort of feelings there?
Combat
I mean, I know you said you were in the back, kind of, but
Combat, after all, is all about destruction and killing. So there's nothing funny about it. The comment in this form that we fill out that wondered what was humorous.
Yeah.
Well, back in the barracks, there's humor and there's fun. But,
Mm-hmm.
Up front, when you're being shot at or about to be shot at, there is a certain amount of humor, but it isn't any fun.
Mm-hmm.
So, aside from that, being in combat is a mixture of absolutely nothing going on, going you could call it boredom, but
Mm-hmm.
just nothing going on and waiting and wondering, and that can go on for days.
Yeah.
It ranges from that point to terror and everything in between, any adjective that you wanted to use.
Yeah.
So you can take your pick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I read your bio. I know you had several medals and everything, but which medals or citations did you receive and why?
Well, the most important was the Silver Star, which is a high-ranking award for what it's called is gallantry in action. That's what that does. I was in a position when I was captured that I was with a small, badly worn-out remnants of a platoon of infantrymen in a situation where Army intelligence thought that the Germans were mounting a large attack. It wasn't true, but nobody knew it.
Mm-hmm.
So we were in a tiny village. I have pictures here I can show you a little of, holding the line. Oh, I was sent up to join one unit that I normally would have been with. When I got to the point where I would be assigned and moved forward, I was told to stop. They were being pulled out. I should go over here to another outfit that I had never been near to do the same thing with them, but they were there. They were under orders to hold at all cost, which are bad orders. They did. And in the time I was there, which was 2.5 days, something like that, the expected attack never developed, but we were assaulted 8 times over 2.5 days by tanks, by infantry, heavily shelled, mortars, and it sure looked like an attack if I ever saw one. We had casualties, they had casualties, we had tanks killed, they had tanks killed, and it was just a full-fledged war in a small place, in a little village. The whole purpose of our being there was that we controlled supply lines, that we had the ability to see and affect 2 major highways that ran parallel to our front. Farther west, there was still German army, so we were sort of in the middle of the side of a huge bulge in the front lines. And that was why our units were there. We had control of a vital set of roadways that were about 2 miles apart and parallel up to where they had troops that needed to have ammunition and supplies and people and all that. So that's what we were doing. It looked very real, and it was real. A sidelight was that we were in a small, sort of a communal country community, probably no more than 10 houses on the crossroads, but ours was several families, sort of a communal thing apparently, which was built of stone, but it was built partly against the side of a hill, so it had, call it a root cellar, dug into the side of the hill, completely underground, with access from the buildings. 25 people were in that root cellar all the time we were there. Civilians, ranging from age 82, the old lady that owned the place, to a 4-month-old baby. And they underwent the same stuff we did because it was going on over their heads. And we were above ground.
Yeah.
So they eventually were picked up shortly after we were marched off as well. So it was a wild time and various happenings. casualties and stuff, and then a bad end for us. We ran out of. Biggest thing was that we were remote. The people behind us had been cleaned out, so we were remote from any other American troops by as much as a half a mile, and probably that was just observation. That wasn't real people that could help, and we were in contact with telephone lines. Infantry had them, we had them, but those lines got cut either by artillery fire or midnight patrol before the night before we were captured. We had no telephone communication. The infantry had radios, we had radios. The radios died. Batteries froze or something. Infantry went first. I was the last contact. My batteries died, and that was it. I couldn't help.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in contact, I would have to say the folks that were supporting me really went to work. It was astounding how much artillery, the records, I didn't really know this, but they really went all out to help, which was very pleasing.
Mm-hmm.
After the fact, but they did a heck of a job, and it was the way it was supposed to be. But in any case, no communication, can't help yourself.
Yeah.
The infantry commander had gone. He had lost communication where he had been as well. So nobody knew what happened to this about 30 men. They all weren't all the same platoon. There were other kinds of clusters there too, but nobody knew what happened to them. The infantry had no contact. They didn't know. The artillery knew what was going on. I have the logbook that they kept that described what was going on. They, however, didn't tell the infantry. The infantry didn't reach out to the artillery and say, hey guys, you know what's going on up there? Just, again, communication failures all the way around. The infantry was so concerned that they scraped up 15 men from a different part of their frontage. They covered half a mile or so. 15 men, and sent them across to try and find us, see what was going on. They went without knowing what was there, and they ran into the tanks that were still in the woods up above us.
Mm-hmm.
And they were all killed. They never got to us. Their frozen bodies were found 2 days after the event. So nobody knew. We just got whisked off.
Mm-hmm.
And there were a few who saw some things, but they really didn't know what they saw. And so there was an incomplete report about what our fate was. It took a long time to reconstruct. As fate would have it, we were finished on the 8th of January. At that time, the German army was under orders for the 10th, 2 days later, to begin their complete retreat. So when they came out 24 hours later to try and find what was in this place we were, they didn't find any Germans. They just abandoned the place and withdrawn. So they didn't know what happened. They didn't know there was a retreat on, so they cautiously sent out patrols.
Yeah.
They went 15 miles before they found the first German.
Wow.
Going away.
Yeah.
With us just ahead of them by 1 day's transit.
Yeah.
It was Well, a strange set of circumstances. And nobody knew.
Yeah.
Nobody knew. They had an idea, but there wasn't much of another conclusion because there weren't a lot of dead bodies lying around for them to find.
Yeah.
We got the casualties out the night before we were taken. But just, that's how it goes.
Yeah.
Multiply it by 100 times, and
Yeah.
that's how it goes.
Let's see. How did you keep in touch with those at home, and how often did you?
Well, let's just limit it to being in Europe with fighting forces. The access we had would be rare if we got leave and could get back to where the Red Cross had locations. It was possible
Yeah.
to possibly telegraph. No telephone communication,
Yeah.
no radio, no nothing. We communicated by so-called email, which was letter writing. And you did it on a particular form that was provided by the military. That went to a processing center in the States where it was photographed, and reels of photographed letters called V-mail, victory mail,
Yeah.
went out. And sometimes they went by ship, which was slow. Sometimes they went out in airplanes. Tens of thousands of them on several reels of film, of course. And then they get reprinted on paper and delivered through the military mail, which worked if it worked. But during, say, the Battle of Bulge, nothing happened for 3 weeks. No mail.
Yeah.
A lot of other things to take care of.
Yeah.
And the mail just stacked up. And so I still have a bunch of letters that I wrote. My family got after I was gone. Letters they wrote to me that I never got that were returned to them. My wife was writing to me and the same things. We have a stack of letters that never got anywhere, but there were several times when we were in transit, when you lose 2 or 3 weeks, and then during that period of time. So that was literally it. And when I eventually was freed as a captive, it came back as soon as possible after we were freed, that we were afforded through the Red Cross again a telegram that we could send home, and that worked practically instantly. But all we said was that we're okay.
Yeah.
We couldn't, there was no telephone again, no radio, no nothing. But that was the first word my folks got, was of course the telegram was sent for me a few days after I was freed, probably about the 1st of May. But they got that word. In between time, nothing. Theoretically, we as prisoners had, I may have got one postcard through, I'm not sure of that. I just don't think it got through. But when I was a captive, of course, what had been a fairly orderly prisoner of war system that the Germans maintained, according to the rules pretty much too, had fallen apart from the beginning of 1945. Everything was in flux and everything was a mess and nothing worked. And so it was just nothing to be said about it. Everybody tried, but there was no way to make things work.
Yeah.
And that's, communication was hot.
Yeah.
Communication. Really hot.
Yeah. Let's see here. What was the food like and the supplies that you had available to you?
Very poor to abysmal. Military food on our side was far better than the German army was able to have.
Mm-hmm.
You got to give the cooks and bakers a huge amount of credit because of their, let's say, devotion and determination to try to get hot food from the areas where the cooking occurred up to the front lines.
Yeah.
Which usually was, they had pretty good containers to put things in, and there were guys that drove jeeps up and got blown up in landmines, and they would be operating in the middle of the night to get hot food up, and of course the K ration and the C ration were things that you could carry around on your body, and that was principally it. But the cooks and bakers were just fantastic. They weren't often obliged to fight. Sometimes they were, but they gave it in devotion to the job and to the troops. It was really remarkable.
Yeah.
So our situation, food-wise, was at times it was terrible because they couldn't get it through.
Yeah.
But other times it was the best you could expect, and it was very, very good comparatively. The Germans tried, but they largely lived off the land and foraged.
Yeah.
And were on their own a great deal to either make it or starve. So, in that sense, we were in as good shape as we could be, as humanly possible. A prisoner of war situation is entirely a different thing.
Yeah.
That was dangerous, and starvation, literally. There wasn't anybody that didn't lose 30 pounds. Some others did, and then illnesses that went with it, and injuries and wounds and such, and it was pretty well, we would talk about that for a long time, but that was my post-military experience.
Yeah.
But I don't know exactly how far, we could go 3 hours on that.
Yeah.
That's a 3-hour lecture.
Wow.
Anyway.
Yeah, how about, like, the supplies you use, like, I guess, anything else, like weapons, or,
what's it again?
just the supplies, like, that you had, like, what were the, how were those, like, I guess, were they, always working? We were well fed, we were well clothed. The biggest issues during that time, at least, it was midwinter, of course. In the coldest winter for 50 years that there had been. Wow.
It went on steadily for the greater part of the month, unbreaking. Previous to that, it was rain and mud. That's natural.
Yeah.
Over there. That's dangerous because if you slog around without proper foot gear for long enough, you end up with trench foot. And as it gets colder, then it becomes frostbite and absolute freezing sometimes. There were, I included, had frostbite injuries. There were people who simply froze to death in the foxholes. So imagine anything you want to, it all happened. And the weather was equally tough on both armies. The weather was responsible for the big success of that German offensive because the whole area was fog-bound, is the best way, plus snowstorms, and the Air Force couldn't operate. Hitler had about 3 weeks of not being bothered by the U.S. Air Force, or the British Air Force, because he couldn't see anything to attack. And once the Air Force was able to function, it was catastrophic for the enemy. Very helpful to us, but and for us as prisoners of war, we were in danger from the U.S. Air Force because not I personally, but as a general thing, columns of men on a highway you can't tell one
Yeah.
side from the other from
Mhm.
the air. So there were columns of men that were strafed. I was in one that part of it was strafed. Boxcars, we got shipped in railroad boxcars, and that was a risk, because railroad trains were a hot target.
Yeah.
And we had close call. I never was in one that was strafed. Others were. They got caught in bombing raids and wiped out that way.
Did they know that the prisoners of war were being transported by boxcar, or
I suppose.
Yeah.
How do you know?
probably
They
assume?
were the same boxcars that were used to haul military equipment and
Yeah.
food, and thousands of Jews and others to the crematories.
Mhm.
The cars had bullet holes in them. No facilities of any kind. Too many people in the boxcar, and no heat. And whatever food you had with you if you were lucky to receive it. And no way to get out. They'd stop because they were afraid of an air attack, and the Germans would all run and hide, and there we'd be.
Yeah.
And I had a friend who, one of the prison camps I was in was called Limburg, and it was a noted camp near a railroad yard. Before I got there, just before Christmas of 1944, I think it was, I don't know, British or American Air Force hit the railroad yard. And they had a hang fire and one bomb that landed in one of the barracks. And I think there were almost 100 officers killed at that time. I had a friend who was in the same railroad yard. His boxcar was locked, and he was in it with lots of other people, with bombs falling all around, but they didn't get hit. They just happened in the open space between the bombs.
Wow.
I have a little piece that he wrote about that many years ago. That's how I identified him and found him after that. There's a great thing that my wife and I have done over all the time in between is finding people all over the nation that I knew for 5 minutes. I might have a clue about. Most I didn't, but
Yeah.
of the people that I passed by with or spent some time with during all those times, it's sort of a hobby. If we can find a piece of thread to start pulling, so we can find them. Some were easy, but some were really quite a piece of work.
Wow, that's interesting.
And
Yeah.
so rewarding, because our taking the time to do that frequently was a great honor that we would think to do it in the lifestyle that others had.
Yeah.
Anyway, lots of stories.
Yeah.
One generates from another.
Yeah. What was your most memorable experience and why?
I don't know what I said. May I peek?
No
What page are we on?
cheating.
Probably holding it, hold at all costs, surviving it, and surviving what came after that. That was a pretty hairy experience.
Yeah.
We did lots of, well, we were talking about awards, and the gallantry for action was that I, as a forward observer, several times called by artillery fire down on our heads. We were in a building, but when we left, the building was burning down over our heads, and I had done it. There was a little church that I fired a mission out of from the steeple, and that was near the other building, a different place, and that I have pictures of the destroyed properties that we were in, so to speak. But that was the big thing.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, my artillery guys were highly supportive and highly loyal, and they knew that I was up there and they were fighting for me, which was a great tribute. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
you're not supposed to do that, generally, so that's what that's all about.
Let's see. How did you feel about your military experiences? Why?
Well, first point I made was that after Pearl Harbor, her life and my life were not controlled by ourselves anymore.
Mm-hmm.
The war led us, encroaching military service on my part, her urge to serve somehow, somewhere, freedom to make up our own minds, go where we wanted to, didn't account whether or not we wanted to get married, didn't matter. We didn't have to face anything like you do in driving your own life and deciding where it's going for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
We went where the time and the circumstances dictate, and we were ordered.
Mm-hmm.
I was sort of always near the military life here in red light is on.
All right. Yeah, we're good.
Where were we?
We were talking about your wife's experience.
Lives. Like I almost had been in the Plattsburgh camps here and went to Europe in the First World War, came back and was constantly active and socially active with the military people here. Mother's brother was a military. My father, I'm a child of the 26th Infantry,
Mm-hmm.
is what it amounts to. My aunt married another officer here in Plattsburgh. Another uncle was stationed
Military.
as the gold in my 26th Infantry was constantly in places good. With the military school and ROTC, all the rest, continued Army Reserve. The whole military career for 20 years, in good times and bad, with many stories to tell, of both varieties.
Mm-hmm.
Served at several different bases in the United States, and with stories to tell. It generally was, military life was generally okay. That you don't know what a person is like until you put them all in a uniform and they all then stand out in different ways. And so there was much of that through all the years. Mm-hmm. Bond, come to the particular thing. You lifelong friends in that way. You have many fantastic people and many that are not so good, but it all It all was valuable. It was all
Mhm.
valuable. Maybe I just as soon have been doing something else, but nobody else was doing anything else, so that was a choice that was
Yeah.
just not there.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't, well, the fact that I continued in the reserve means that it meant something important to me.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And my brother did the same. He's a Korean
Yeah.
vet, and he was married even when he got pulled off, which is a different aspect.
Wow.
But I hung in there longer.
Yeah. How did you feel about the use of the atomic bomb and why?
I would never criticize the use of the atomic bomb. I returned from what I had undergone. I was given some leave to get healthy again, reassigned back to Fort Sill to learn how to be a frontline artillery observer again, as they assumed that I had lost all my knowledge and credibility.
Mm-hmm.
And where was I going? I was going to Japan.
Yeah.
It was over shortly after we got married, so I wasn't going to go to Japan.
Mhm.
But I was locked into that plan no matter what, and was in the service 4 months more than they needed me for anything, but that's the way it was.
Hmm.
There isn't anybody of my generation that would do anything but punch you between the eyes if you criticize the use of the atom bomb.
Yeah.
Just that simple. Well, it saved a million lives.
Yeah.
Ours.
Mm-hmm. How did you learn about VJ Day, and what were your feelings about that?
VJ Day. We had just been married. We had a 3-day honeymoon, and we were off on orders to report to Asheville, North Carolina for my rehabilitation of my military records and physical exams and such, and then reassignment. We were halfway there in a rickety old car and ended up in a flea bag motel in Shippensburg, Pennsylvania, when VJ Day was announced, and we were on the outskirts of town. It was flea bag because we found we had bed bugs in the motel. I mean, there were no television, no nothing. It was a cold water thing. And we heard lots of cheering and noise and maybe even people shooting off guns, but a great deal of riotous activity down in town. We didn't have any radio. Nobody came to tell us what was going on. So it was VJ Day.
Yeah.
We stayed out of it because we didn't see any point in getting involved in some local riot and getting wiped out in a family fight or something.
Probably best.
we didn't find out about it until the next morning. It was all over. But so that was our VJ Day celebration.
When you were in the war, were you aware of the concentration camps, and what was your reaction when you found out about those?
I specifically don't know when I became fully aware of concentration camps. I must have known about them. However, I spent 4 months in Germany. I went from village to village. I went from prison camp to prison camp. From neglect, illness, danger, solitary confinement and interrogation, passing through villages that had been blown to hell and gone, threatened in one village that had been recently bombed by the populace that wanted to stone us and hoist us up on hit forks and stuff like that. It was wise not to have an aviator's uniform if you were marching in a column of POWs. Slave labor gets fairly close to death camps. Russian slave labor is right on the doorstep of being in a death camp. We ran into a situation involving that kind of a thing, and an episode that took place involving them and how the German guards treated them and such. So I had a pretty good feel for some of the bad sides of the German people and the German system. But specifically, and of course from the prison camp side too, which were not death camps. People died, but they weren't extermination camps. People were shot, things. So yes, I was on the fringes of intimate knowledge, but specific knowledge about the whole system in depth, I wasn't.
Yeah.
But I lived pretty close to that at times. So I have great empathy for it, and I'm very interested in the things that happen when they celebrate, the Jewish community celebrates in the spring here on campus. And I have been to a number of those.
Yeah.
Know a number of people that have lived past that. And there are many folks that have relatives that are on in this community.
Yeah.
And some survivors as well. But well, what do you know when you're 18, 19 years old and you don't know much?
Yeah.
But when you stop and think about it, bite by bite by bite, there were many similarities in
Yeah.
where I lived.
And how did you learn about VE Day, and where were you, and what were your feelings then?
VE Day, I was at the last prison camp that I got to, which was in Bavaria. We'd been 285 miles from where I was captured, all across part of Belgium and Luxembourg, and then Germany all the way there. By one means or another, ended up at that camp perhaps 10 days before it was freed by the American Army. It was a camp called Moosburg, which was built in the 1940s as a transit processing camp for soldiers of all the armies that the German army was fighting at that time. And they must have had 25 nationalities that passed through that camp. It was supposed to be a focusing down and then a reassignment location built for 10,000 people. When it was liberated, it had 108,000 people in it, of which 3,500 perhaps were Americans. We were segregated from most of it, but it represented every nation in Europe by the tens of thousands, some military, many were different grades of civilian captives. But can you imagine, as commander of the 7th Army, or I guess it was the 3rd Army that freed us, General Patton again, having suddenly to take care of another 100,000 people that needed to be fed, all in one swoop.
Yeah.
What a day's work that is, and what a pain. So it was unmanageable, totally unmanageable. It took an awful long time to get on top of that, and therefore, while I was officially back in the U.S. Army on April 29, which was VE Day, or Liberation Day, VE Day was May 8th. So during a period of time I was liberated. I got a medal for being in the Army of Occupation because I was, once again, a U.S. soldier and I was on German soil.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't raise a finger at that, but I got a medal, which was
Yeah.
important, because each medal you got was worth 5 points on your discharge scale.
Yeah.
The more points you had, the sooner you got discharged. So
Huh.
you collected all the medals you could get for any cause you could get. So anyway, that was a big event.
Mm-hmm.
The trouble is that I was captured twice, freed 3 times before it was all over. And each time they come to liberate the jail you're in, there's an awful lot of firing going on. Shooting at each other, and there's rockets, and there's tank fire, and they batter each other around. And of
Mhm.
course, there you are, groveling on the floor or a ditch or something or other, and the bullets are going through your prison camp while one side drives the other away from it. And, well, it's a little bit hair-raising to be freed. We didn't, for anywhere I was, we didn't suffer casualties.
Yeah.
We watched the bullets go by. Like I say, I was liberated twice. General Patton had a son-in-law who was a colonel who got captured in the North African phases, which were several years before my time. And
Mhm.
he was in the system in Germany for a long time. And General Patton was obsessive about getting him out because he was a valuable son-in-law and he was a colonel. And his career was interrupted and he needed to be put back to work because the Army needed him, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And Patton drove everybody crazy with that philosophy. At times you knew where other prisoners were, especially high rankers. Nobody ever knew where I was.
Yeah.
You might know where the full colonel was. But they got moved. And then in January, everything fell apart. Nobody knew anything. And he was on a long road march from the Baltic Sea down through Germany. And the only place that column, which went 600 miles before it was done, could end up was where we were. So Patton was within 60 miles. He sent out a strike force of 300 men in tanks and such to come and free our camp that his son-in-law was in, by the way. He sent his favorite long-time military aide along with it to find the right person, is all that ever was admitted until after Patton died. It was evident from many different scraps of information, although he constantly denied it. And they came and they knocked down the walls, and we were freed in different ways. I joined a couple of other guys, and we tried to take off across country, which didn't work.
Yeah.
A couple of days we got bagged up again, but mostly all got taken back to camp and then started marching out or getting shipped out in boxcars.
Yeah.
So that was one event. That was the first liberation, and the second big one was the one that took.
Yeah. What did you do when you arrived home?
Well, I didn't kiss the ground. I was kind of matter of fact about it because I wanted to get home. I got access to a phone. The lines that long in front of payphones when we finally got established at a camp outside New York Harbor. Came home, I got trapped, and I got married. I was in a weakened condition, and my wife snatched me off. She would deny it, but anyway. And well, I was still recovering from malnutrition mostly.
Mm-hmm.
And, so there was that, and then moving on and getting reassigned and all those kind of things.
Mhm.
Those are the activities. It's anecdotal that people have a strange feeling about watching the Statue of Liberty go by when you leave New York Harbor in a ship and then coming back. And it's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
Hmm.
It's a real, it's really symbolic of something special.
Yeah.
Especially to see it the second time.
Yeah. It's going to be a good feeling. Do you belong to any veterans organizations now, or?
Well, yes. There's a million you could belong to.
Yeah.
I belong to the American Legion here. My
Mhm.
father was the creator of the post-20 American
Oh,
Legion, so I wouldn't think of anything else. But matter of fact, he had me in it before I was back from Europe.
Yeah.
In any case, I've been there ever since. And,
Yeah.
and I'm sort of identified because I'm the oldest son of the commander.
Oh,
I
okay.
belong to an organization of former prisoners of war. I belong to an association related to the military division that I was in. Now they're running out of gas because they're mostly people of World War II. So
Mhm. Yeah.
the 87th Division thing had its last reunion run by the old guard. There's a new group of their children who were trying to keep it going.
Yeah.
That's sort of doubtful, I think. And the old guys had more and more trouble getting there, of course.
Yeah.
It was enjoyable, but they've run out of gas.
Yeah.
They were making, two of them making farewell remarks, and two of them said, well, you know, I just barely made this. I went to see my doctor a couple of days before I had to come up here, and he said, it was about time for me to have a stent put in an artery in my heart, and we better get at it. And I said, you wait right here, I'll be back in 10 days. Two of them came up with the same story.
Wow.
I haven't heard that they didn't make it.
Yeah.
That's how important it was.
Yeah. Reunions mean something, I guess. Wow. And I know you've already kind of said, but so how's your military experience changed or influenced your life? Any other comments on that, or I think you already pretty much laid it down a little bit before? But.
Well, it established my life for
Yeah,
5 years,
obviously.
and my life changed after I wasn't in the military.
Yeah.
Then I was a civilian, a different category, and went back to law school and went on to earn a living and all the other things.
Yeah.
But yes, well, as we've just said, there's bonds, there's friends, there's stories to tell, and constantly there are new things to find out that I never knew. So it never stops being something that I, and I'll say I, am associated with, that's of interest to me,
Mm-hmm.
that I continue to learn from. In some respects I can be helpful and useful. In some respects I am willing and able to do what we're doing. I've done it lots at different levels. So yes, all that's valuable to me. I understand about the military and how it runs and how things are when the going is bad and all that. So that never goes away.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to be said, of course, that many people have suffered far more than I did in a way that damaged them.
Yeah.
They came away physically damaged or mentally damaged. There are people that just won't talk about it, that haven't talked about it for 60
Yeah.
years, and never will. I never felt that way about it because I didn't get in it, if you will, as deep
Mm-hmm.
in the killing stage as others. That would change it, no question.
Mm-hmm.
So it varies. It depends on
Yeah.
if you were in charge of keeping tank truck number 1 full of gasoline and running it back and forth, why, you'd have a different point of view about military life, and you might have played with the black market or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But, no, I was real life military, and it's part of my structure.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I guess that kind of.
You think you shot your wad?
Yeah.
Well,
I think that's pretty much
you
it.
followed it. You followed the script pretty well.
Yeah.
Let me just, for your own donation.
I like that. Thank you.
This
again.
is
Or yeah, you can go ahead and.
well, it won't show up on the camera,
Yeah.
but here is a picture, December of 1944. Those are field artillerymen. They're living in a hole in the ground. They have a stove down there,
Wow.
and they're burning the cardboard packages that the artillery ammunition was shipped in. If you could see his face, it's probably the color of charcoal,
Yeah.
because they were burning stuff that was full of creosote, breathing it and so on. And this picture isn't good enough to show a gun position. That's a pup tent, but these are
Yeah.
gun crew members. That's a very, very famous picture of winter warfare. They're for infantry guys with their pup tents, and they've been issued snowshoes, so they may not have frostbite injuries.
Mm-hmm.
But they're in the chow line, and that picture has been repeated many times in famous places. One of our units being served in the mess kit.
So these aren't pictures you have personally
They're
taken or
US,
anything? Or?
well, they come from different sources. That's from the U.S. Signal Corps that a close friend in Washington who was my father grew up with, and he was the chief clerk of our congressman. So he busted his butt down there in all the back alleys and hallways in behalf of my family, trying to find out something
Yeah.
about me while I was missing.
Oh, really?
And he produced these pictures from Signal Corps archives. That's the dead-end telegram that shuts a family down.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah,
Something
but
like
it's a
that.
real, when you run it through your mind, that doesn't say anything except disappeared in space,
Yeah.
no advice, no hope,
Yeah.
no effort to find out what happened, no promise of any kind.
Yeah. You can see why the first message back would just be, I'm
Yeah.
okay.
Well, yeah, and no communications, of course,
Yeah.
after that, not a single thing, complete destitution. It's almost easier to have it killed in action with
Yeah.
because you know something.
Yeah.
They were 92 days before they found out that I had been alive once after that.
Yeah.
And that's because a fellow from Plattsburgh was at the same prison camp I was at. And he had enlisted in the Canadian Army. But we fell together in this prison camp, got to know each other. And he was an enlisted man, but he was Canadian besides. I was an officer and I was an American. So I went off in a different direction from that camp before he did. They shipped me east, shipped him west to get joined up with British and Canadian
Yeah.
troops. Sooner or later, they preferred to do it that way, I guess. But in any case, he was freed a month before I was. in that process, and he got his telegram to send to his mother, and he told her, number one, I'm fine, I'm free, I'm not hurt. Number two, call across town and tell Lawyer Booth and his family that I saw his son on such and such, but at such a period, which was 92 days before that went through. That's the first glimmer of hope that they had.
Yeah.
In spite of all the
Yeah.
efforts that my father was doing through all the channels that he had. The whole process is a whole other story.
Yeah.
They went through, what a family goes through. That's my place of work. The big building is our stronghold and had the root cellar, and the roof has fallen in because I set it on fire. It was coming down around our rears sooner or later before we got captured out of it.
Wow, that's a mess.
It was a multi-story building. Next to it was the little church, and it had, I think I did that too. It had a steeple where one of the infantry guys had gone up and taken a peek, and he saw a tank sitting over on top of a hilltop. Just could see their radio antennas.
Yeah.
Up through the underbrush, and they were looking at some of our troops off in another direction, so we dumped some artillery on them and sent them away. That is a real live prison camp that I was in at Limburg. That happens to be sick bay. Those people are sick, but that's exactly what they look like.
Yeah.
Whether they were sick or not. Everybody had dysentery or diarrhea.
Yeah.
Everybody was losing weight from malnutrition. Everybody could develop one or another kind of an additional illness.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. That was taken about a side issue of whose son is alive and whose son is dead, but that's what the inside of that looked like. And those were the first atrocity pictures that came out just about that time, and the one there was, I knew him. He was in my division. He was captured a day after I was.
Wow.
He probably had pneumonia, so he was in sick bay. He couldn't even get up and waddle around. But the interesting sidelight he survived.
Yeah.
These people, that guy survived.
Wow. It looks like a skeleton.
Joe Demler, he was still alive in 1996. He weighed 68 pounds.
Jeez.
And he was liberated. Well, anyway, that's some that were super sick.
Yeah, that's
really had to. Oh, I was going to tell you, he had pneumonia or something and was feverish, so he was warmer than the rest of us.
Oh, weird.
His body temperature was 3 or 4 degrees more than the rest of us.
Yeah.
We all had body lice. The body lice liked a warm body better than a cold body.
Yeah.
So he had 4 times the number of lice of somebody like me who wasn't sick.
Yeah.
That was a very strange kind of thing, and they were sucking him dry, among other things. So that's just a sideline.
Yeah. Wow.
What it's all about. I've got other pictures, but it's kind of hard to get pictures from prison.
Yeah. I was going to say, it seems pretty weird that they would actually even have any, but... Just seems strange that they would even, like, do you know who took these pictures? This was right after
This is a print from Time magazine, so either their reporter did or it's an assembled from Associated Press or goodness.
Yeah. Huh.
It's a composite, and it's not, I don't think, Well, during the time that these would have been generated, they were beginning to run on to the prison camps and to capture them, so there were probably several different ones that could have been spliced together, but it just, because I don't know these other guys.
Yeah.
Specifically, I know him and I know where he was, and I don't think he even got moved out of that camp. He couldn't travel.
Yeah.
Tom Barry did, and he's the one who reported on me back home.
Yeah.
And I went, we sailed from New York Harbor, and we landed in Liverpool, England, and came in several different ships, assembled a military division of 15,000 men in a number of villages, then brought in their equipment and outfitted them with the right number of trucks and equipment and things like that. And that took the better part of 3 weeks. And moved the whole thing in a body across England to the Channel, where we got on a series of ships and went toward France, and some ended up on the French shore. We went out in an LST, a landing ship tank, which held approximately our whole unit of 500 men and vehicles and guns. We went up the River Seine. Now, if you take out an atlas and look at the River Seine, it goes into France, and it goes like this.
Yeah.
And on the right bank is where the great breakthrough that took place after the landings, the Falaise Gap, and the German army piled up against the river. The U.S. Air Force was working, so anything that got jammed up against the river was just shredded. Mounds and miles of shredded personnel and horses and people and everything else.
Wow.
You could see the fringe of that wreckage along the ridge beside the river. This was December. That had happened in August. All piled up there. A bridge here and there would be blown.
Yeah.
They couldn't get across the bridges.
So they were just
This LST, which was 100 feet long, maybe 150. Flat bottom. It steered like a building block. No keel. And the commander had to get that thing through a river that was 1/3 as wide because the bridge blocked it. There was an opening, and because the water was forced around by the wreckage, there was a current in there that made it exceedingly difficult to hold out of the ship. How he did that, I have any idea. We got through.
Yeah.
And we were 50 miles inland when we were over as the crow flies. We'd probably gone 100 miles on the river to get there.
Weaved everywhere.
Yeah. We unloaded in a city called Rouen at the steps of an ancient cathedral. It goes back 486 years or 1,000 years. It's very picturesque.
Yeah.
We simply drove off it. But in any case, in that ship, I bunked in with a naval officer named Lieutenant Porto. I had the upper deck and he had the lower deck, or lower bunk in his statement, and we were together a couple of days. And we said farewell and didn't think we'd ever see. Coming out in June from France, they eventually got to the shore and were loading up on a ship to come back. And who should I meet wandering about the dock but Lieutenant Porto?
Wow, that's crazy.
And we compared notes about what we'd been doing for the last 6 months, and I'd had a wilder time than he had.
Yeah.
Because he was just a ferry boat captain.
Oh.
on the Channel, which by that time was not bad duty.
Yeah.
But the city of Le Havre, which is a major port, was a major target. I mean, they got hit by the British Air Force and the U.S. Air Force. And the navies of both, and there was nothing there but shreds of this and that. And
Yeah.
if there were buildings, they were piles of rubble, and if there were docks, they were all askew. And the only way you could still use it as a harbor, and full of sunken ships, too. So it was a real nest, and as a harbor, it was very hard to use at best. But the docks were simply, well, specially made barges. They're floatable,
Yeah.
tied to the shore, and that's the best use they could make out of a major harbor in Europe at the time, which was the last, coming down there through that city, having come across all of France, where everything was destitution, shot up, homes gone, businesses dead, cattle still, all the rest. And then you come to Le Havre, absolute wasteland. Springtime, it was June, grass was green. You'd think flowers would be coming up, well, they weren't.
Yeah.
Grass was green. The trees, there wasn't a tree that was strong enough to grow a leaf. They were just shattered.
Wow.
Total desolation, and it was just the last memory I had of Europe, and I never cared whether I went back there
Yeah.
for 50 years. It never interested me. I wouldn't have stirred if somebody had given me a ticket
Yeah.
to go and see it, although I knew deep in my heart it was much different. They've rebuilt. It's
Yeah.
magnificent now. Until about 50 years later, a group of this prisoner of war organization put together a private, self-arranged tour, which about 50 of us, and wives and daughters and such, took. And the object was that we were going to go to a particular place individually important to each of us. And it worked. The people that ran it had been back and forth and had relationships with things like the American Legion that exists over there. And it was a good hookup because we always had a couple of those people with us wherever we went, who spoke the language too. It was helpful. We had to deal with French. We had to deal with the Luxembourg language, which some claim they can speak and some find they can't, because it's a mixture of German and their own thing, and a little bit of French.
Yeah.
And you've got to be on your toes to do that. But that was a very satisfying thing. And I guess we've been to England several times, but just once in France. That satisfied.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely didn't care about it a bit.
Yeah. Well, after being through all that.
Yeah.
See how
Well, it's terrible what we can do
Yeah.
to each other.